Go. Good evening. I'm Linda Pearse.
And I'm Karin Cuellar.
We are joined tonight by Rosemarie Dugas on organ.
We are going to present Musicking off the cuff.
Models for early music improvisation. How did musicians improvise in the 16th and 17th centuries? We consider two key sources published 100 years apart. First, Diego Ortiz's 1553 treatise, Tratado de Glosas.
Second, we will consider Christopher Simpson's treatise from 1659, the division viol.
Both treatises were written for the viola da gamba, but they were considered by other instrumentalists as well. We put them in conversation, derive guidelines, and create our own improvisations.
Our 30-minute Research Alive presentation will have the following structure. First, we will discuss early music improvisation practices within the context of music making in the Renaissance and early Baroque periods.
Second, we will analyze and provide performed examples from both treatises.
Third, we will contrast and compare both Ortiz and Simpson's approaches to improvisation.
Fourth, we will talk about how we learn to improvise and take you through our process.
Finally, we will perform our own improvisations.
How did instrumentalists improvise over pre-existent material in the 16th century? What seems an impossible feat is actually rooted in techniques similar to those that vocalists used in church music. Improvisation over a cantus firmus, a plain song, was taught in choir schools throughout the Renaissance. Students learned to sing intervals consonant against the cantus firmus and to consider motions to other notes that agreed with the rules of counterpoint. They memorized incredible amounts of chants, glosses, and liturgical texts. As skill and confidence grew, so too the complexity and virtuosity of the improvisation. For Ortiz, consonant intervals are thirds, fifths, and sixths above the bass note. They sound sweet and delight the ear. Rosemarie will now play a cantus firmus, and after she goes through it once, I will sing a simple melody employing consonant intervals over her line. The works we consider are created over repeating ostinato figures. Ostinatos function like blues changes do in jazz. They provide a repeating harmonic and metric framework over which performers improvise.
For both Ortiz and Simpson, their approach mirrors that of the jazz musician. We look for repeated material, melodic ideas, structural devices, and stylistic features.
This process allows us to derive guidelines to improvisation in the style of each writer. The passamezzo antico is an Italian dance form which provides the harmonic and metric foundation for the work by Ortiz that we consider today. In his treatise, Ortiz notes that he is writing 8 ricercatas over Italian tenors, perhaps a nod to a Renaissance compositional approach organized around the tenor voice. This slide shows the intervals above and below the tenor voice in Ortiz's Ricercata Primera. Looking closely at Ortiz's realization, it becomes apparent that the intervals between tenor and cantus move in parallel sixths, those between the altus and tenor in alternating thirds and fourths, and between the bass and tenor in alternating thirds and fifths. This type of setting was common to Renaissance music and is described in treatises well before Ortiz's. Monacus, in the 1480s, describes this texture as a type of faux-bourdon. In Peter Schubert's terminology, it is called the parallel sixth model, and it is also known as falso bordone. Several resulting basses ended up as formulas for people to improvise over, and this type of composition becomes associated with and defined by the movement of the bass line during the transition from the Renaissance to the Baroque. Rosemarie will now play Ortiz's realization of the passamezzo antico. Spanish composer and theorist Diego Ortiz moved from his birthplace, Toledo, Spain, to Naples, Italy, at some point before the publication of his treatise in 1553. The Tratado de Glosas is his most prominent and significant publication, appearing in both Italian and Spanish. His treatise is divided into two parts. The first provides examples of cadential ornamentation, and the second, what Ortiz describes as the manner to be observed in descanting, including 8 recercadas over ostinatos. These recercadas are written out examples of improvisation over a repeating harmonic framework. They serve as models for improvisation for the early music performer, much like transcriptions of jazz do for the jazz performer. By examining the recercadas of Ortiz, we determine that there are many shared features among the pieces.
Structural features include that consonant tones are used on all beats, and that dissonances appear only as prepared suspensions at cadences or as passing tones.
All of Ortiz's recercadas demonstrate a pervasive use of repetition and syncopation. He papers over the formal repetition of each ostinato by introducing new motives at the end that spill over into the beginning of the next repetition, generating forward motion and excitement. Arpeggiation and scalar passages figure prominently throughout, and he employs frequent use of rhythmic diminution. This example shows the first ostinato setting of Ortiz's Recercada Primera. Frequent repetition of melodic and rhythmic gestures pervade his music. For example, the opening descending motive A appears 3 times within the first iteration of the ostinato, shown in blue. The answering ascending quarter note gesture follows each instance of motive A, 1 time in a transposed form to fit with the harmony implied by the ostinato realization, shown here in red. You will also notice the emphasis on offbeat syncopated gestures. Ortiz deploys motive A again in the 3rd and 4th repetitions of the form, shown here in blue. Motive A also appears transposed down a whole step to provide variety and to allow for a repetition that fits within the harmonic foundation provided by the ostinato, shown in red. Ortiz's recercadas are characterized by an extreme economy of rhythmic and motivic ideas. He uses rhythmic figures to generate new material that is then spun out over the course of the repetition of the ostinato. He frequently accomplishes this by introducing the new material during the final measure of the ostinato pattern, thus minimizing the closed feeling of the harmonically repetitive ostinato and propelling the motion forward, shown here in red. In this slide, we see his use of arpeggiation as a motivic device, the entries in red. Notice that it papers over the end of the ostinato as in the former slide. We also see another example of his motivic economy with the return of motive A, shown in blue, and transposed down a step, shown in green. In the final repetition of the ostinato, the inversion of motive A appears in rhythmic diminution as an imposed triple time, shown in red, signaling the conclusion and high point of the work. It is immediately followed by scalar passages, which create further excitement, shown in green. Through these techniques, Ortiz manages to combine variety and repetition and shape the larger form in a way that is innovative and maintains an overall arc to the improvisation. Karin and Rosemary will now play through the entire piece.
Christopher Simpson was an English theoretician and musician who was active during the first half of the 17th century. In his treatise, The Division Viol, he uses the term ground to refer to what we have presented beforehand as ostinatos. Ostinatos and grounds are the same thing. With the word division, Simpson is referring to the practice of dividing the time of a longer note into multiple smaller ones. This treatise was written in 3 parts, and for this presentation we will focus on part 3, the method of ordering division to a ground, to which Simpson talks about improvisation over a ground which he calls descant division. Simpson presents rules for descant division which are similar to those of Ortiz. He recommends playing thirds, fifths, and octaves over the bass note, and playing sixths above the bass only on weak beats and in suspensions. He further suggests to start improvisation in a simpler manner, becoming more complex as the piece progresses.
The approaches of Simpson and Ortiz diverge in several important ways. Simpson provides detailed written instructions with accompanying musical examples, whereas Ortiz provides complete musical pieces with no instruction. Simpson's melodies are angular, with leaps that frequently change direction and imply chords, whereas Ortiz's melodies are smoother, infused with repetition, and are more scalar, marked by passages of simple arpeggiation and a focus on offbeat syncopated gestures. Simpson always cadences at the end of each repetition of the ostinato, whereas Ortiz papers over the ends of each section to generate forward motion. Simpson composes points of divisions, or riffs, in advance and uses one for each repetition, whereas Ortiz frequently draws on a variety of motives within a given repetition and recycles motives to create coherence across the form.
In this example, Simpson provides 18 possible points of division. Each can be used to begin a repetition of the ground. I will now play the first 3 points of division. In the next example, we see how Simpson uses the points of division in each repetition of the ground, with only some minor changes. We also see that he cadences at the end of each repetition. Exercise, I composed my own points of division over the note G of the ground. Rosemary and I will now play John Come Kiss Me Now by David Mell, composed using Simpson's understanding of points of division.
In learning how to improvise, we devised several steps, which we will share with you now. Note that all of our examples following are improvised. We started by developing familiarity with the possible motions consonant with the bass. As a very first step, we arpeggiated consonant intervals above the bass. Da da dum dum 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 da 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 dum bum bee. And we'd like to invite you to try that as well, because we'd like you to learn how to improvise. Let's do it all together. Da da dum dum da da dum bum da da dum dum da da dum dum da da dum dum da da dum dum da da dum bum bee.
Next, we created horizontal lines starting on different consonant tones.
And we'd like you to share in our joy and participate in this second step. So pick a chord tone. We try not to do parallel fifths, but if you do, no one's going to notice because you're all doing it together. Here we go. One. Da dum da 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 dum da da dum dee dum da dum. Bravo. We wanted to develop familiarity with characteristics of both Ortiz's and Simpson's styles. We noticed that Ortiz introduces a motive at the end of one repetition and develops it in the next. And both Ortiz and Simpson use syncopations, arpeggiation, repetition of motives, and diminution of rhythm. Dum dee dum da da dum, dum dee da da dum da 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 dum, dum dee dum da da dum, dum 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 dee da dum 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 da 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 dum dum dee da 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 dum dum da dum dum da da dum ba da ba dum ba da ba dim ba da dee da dim bum dee.
They both frequently use scalar passages, points of division, and diminution of rhythm in the final repetition of an improvisation. Now that we have shown you all these possibilities, let's all try to improvise over 2 repetitions of the bass.
Together. So don't be shy.
Try everything and anything, scales, arpeggios, or just horizontal lines, whatever it comes to you.
Bravo. As a final step, we plan out a loose large-scale organization for multiple repetitions of the form. So tonight, we're going to take turns improvising over repetitions of the ostinato. We're going to take 2 times through each. We'll attempt to increase excitement and melodic intensity as we go. Dum dee da dum da dee dum, dum dee da da dum dee da da dum, dum dee da da dum da 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 dum dee dee da 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 dum, dum dee da da dum, dum dee da da dum dee da 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 dum da dum da da dum dee da ba dum ba dum da da dum ba dum dee da dum ba da dum bum dee. dum dee da 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 dum da dum dum da da dum da dee dum da dee dee da da dum ba da dee da dum dee da dum da 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 dum da dum dum da 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 ba da ba da ba dum ba da dim bum dee dee dum. Thank you.
We do have time for some questions.
Does anybody have any questions?
In addition to the Ortiz and Simpson treatises, can you recommend other sources that people could look at to find
Yeah.
more?
Ganassi is a great source. And any of the many Italian diminution treatises in the late 16th century and early 17th century are also wonderful sources, particularly for cadential ornamentation, but they're also wonderful for explaining how divisions work in passaggi and ornamentation.
Could you address the possibility of ornamentation of the bass line, of these stock bass lines, and how that would play into the ensemble and improvisation process?
Yeah. So the best ornamentation on a bass line, according to one source, is not too often, and only when it's really appropriate. So bass lines typically have standard stock ornaments that they do, and there are places you can put them in a way that doesn't interfere with the higher voices ornamenting. But in this situation, I mean, I'm a bass saxophone player, and we decided not to have me play, perhaps for that reason, but also because we weren't, I'm not entirely convinced that in 1553, bass saxophones were doing this on Ortiz. So there was a bit of an artistic question there, but yeah, I mean, I think it depends if you're talking about a solo situation or like an ensemble situation. And for ensemble ornamentation, the bass is best with just sort of well-placed ornaments. Real improvisation won't happen in an ensemble situation.
However, Simpson presents in part 2 of his book, Breaking the Ground. And in that instance, he recommends the bass viol player to break the ground, to improvise by breaking the ground, which is playing the notes that are part of the ground and improvising on top of them, but playing the same notes. So this will be the instance that I can think of where the bass would be improvising.
Yeah. Anybody else? Those were good questions. Okay, well, thank you very much. We had a lot of fun preparing this.